Okay, so our Torah portion this week is Emor. If you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash, it's on page 717. Whatever edition of the Chumash or Bible you have, you looking for the book of Leviticus, chapter 21. Chapter 21 of the book of Leviticus, the portion Emor. And just letting in somebody else. So the blessing for Torah study, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So again, in the Eitz Chaim, page 717, the portion is Emor. And a few things I wanted to talk about with this portion. Last week's portion, the double portion, Acharei Mot and Kedoshim, ended with this lengthy description of what is known as the Holiness Code, a series of statements about behaviors that we are supposed to perform in our life that would enable us to be holy. And we had a discussion below the line about what that means, what the word holiness means, how we can define that word. But it's a variety of behaviors. It's not just rituals that we perform in order to be holy. It's not just sacrifices that were to be brought to the temple to make us holy. It's even how we conduct our business affairs, our relationships to our loved ones, etc., that also are involved in making us holy. So that's the average Israelite in order to be holy. Here in this week's portion, our emphasis switches to the Kohanim themselves and how they should maintain a sense of holiness. So all of Israel is holy, and then the Kohanim are a notch above. So they are holy too, but they have to maintain a ritual or spiritual sense of holiness, right? So there's a difference that these portions highlight for us. Holy behavior or attitude is one thing. Holiness, to maintain a status of holiness, is something different that only the Kohanim themselves can do. So the portion, let's read the beginning of the portion and we'll see exactly what this means. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, God said to Moses, Emor el HaKohanim. So this is interesting that the Torah here uses Emor instead of Daber. It's usually Daber, speak to. Here it's Emor, which also means speak to. So the question that Torah scholars would ask is, why is the Torah here using the word Emor and not Daber, which it uses every other place in the Torah? So it's just unusual, and it's unusual enough that the Torah portion is called Emor because of this word, right? It wouldn't be unusual to have a Torah portion called Daber because there's Daber all over the place in the Torah. But here, this is like the only place in the Torah where we have Emor instead of Daber. So Emor el HaKohanim, say to the Kohanim, B'nei Aharon, the sons of Aaron, Ve'amarta lahem, and say to them. So speak to them and speak to them. Say to them and say to them, Lenefesh lo yitama be'amav. None shall defile himself for any person among his kin. And I left out the bracketed word because that's added there because of the context from what's coming below. So a person is not to, a Kohen is not to defile himself with another person. Right, lenefesh, yeah, so the English translation is adding details that the Hebrew doesn't have for us. Lenefesh lo yitama be'amav. A Kohen cannot impurify himself with a person among his people. So the Torah doesn't, in that verse, it doesn't say exactly what that means. But if we just leave it at that, the initial idea is that a Kohen has to be on a different purity level from the rest of the community. So in other words, if we were all together in the same room and I was a Kohen, then and the temple was standing in Jerusalem, and it was my 2 weeks that I'm assigned to work in the temple, then for those 2 weeks, a Kohen who is working in the temple has to maintain this level of purity, so that if we were together in a room, I wouldn't be able to be in the room with you unless I was assured all of you were ritually pure as well. Okay, so since that's usually not the case, most people are not in the status of ritual purity, and previous portions in the book of Leviticus describe how we can be in a state of ritual purity. A Kohen then in this regard is different from all other people among the people of Israel, that they have to maintain this higher level of ritual purity. Okay, now I'd like to look below the line to see what the commentary says about this. So in the Eitz Chaim, we're on 717 below the line. If you have a different edition of the Chumash, you can just listen along. The parasha lives up to the book's alternative Hebrew title, Torah Kohanim, the Priest's Manual. So we're going to learn things in this portion that are specific behaviors that a Kohen has to follow. It focuses on special regulations of Kohanim, and then on the ritual aspects of the sacred calendar. So that a portion that we're very familiar with from that's read on Passover and Sukkot is from this portion, which highlights the sacred occasions celebrated throughout the year. The previous parsha describes the Israelites as being set apart from other nations, called on to attain holiness through their distinctive lifestyle. This parsha sets the Kohanim apart from other Israelites by means of symbolic obligations, restrictions, and abstentions in their lives, right? So it's a hierarchy. Last week, Israelites different from other nations of the world. This week, Kohanim different from rest of the Israelites. As the Israelites are to represent the God-oriented life to the nations of the world, the Kohanim are to represent a maximal level of devotion to God for their fellow Israelites. Every society needs a core of people who live by a more demanding code to set an example for others of what is possible. So I want to read that last sentence again. Every society needs a core of people who live by a more demanding code to set an example for others of what is possible. Every society needs that. So what comes to mind immediately is the state of Israel and the argument that the ultra-Orthodox have, which is exactly this sentence, that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel don't need to serve in the army because they're doing work that's even more important than the army, and it's because of their studies all day, every day in the yeshiva that keeps the state of Israel alive. So the ultra-Orthodox in Israel have this very argument. Every society needs a core of people who live by a more demanding code to set an example for others of what is possible. And it turns out that many in Israel agree with that. Non-Orthodox agree with that statement that we need the ultra-Orthodox to be studying in the yeshiva all day, and we should support them in doing that. Now, I'm not saying that the majority of Israel agrees with that, but there are a good number of non-Orthodox people in Israel who agree with that sentiment. So it's interesting from a for a non-religious society, for a democratic society, is this statement an accurate statement? Like, who would be the people in America who would be the core people who live by a more demanding code to set an example for others of what is possible. I'm not sure. Yes, Sylvia, you're muted, Sylvia. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Obviously, the politicians are the ones that should be leading us
Yeah,
into
right.
what's good.
Okay, so yes, in theory, I laughed a cynical laugh, but yes, it's possible, as Sylvia is suggesting, that politicians, well, let's say it this way. How about the founding fathers back in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, putting together the Declaration of Independence, working out the Constitution? Were those people possibly, in theory, the core people setting the stage for the rest of American society? Possibly. As we look back on them nearly 250 years later, it's possible with rose-colored glasses as to who these founding fathers were and the principles that they came up with. It's possible we could think of them as those people. I'm not sure that there are people in American society today who everybody in America would say, oh yes, I look up to these people as models for me of true American behavior, right? So because society is so fractured today in America, you have a whole variety of organizations, groups of people that claim to be this, to be this group that by which all others in America should look to. Okay, so I don't want to make this a political argument, but I'm just saying that I don't think in American society we have that group of people today. Yes, Jan, unmute yourself.
But aren't there certain professions that we hold to higher standards? I'm not saying it's necessarily as high as the priest, but like, for example, clergy, teachers, doctors, police officers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not in every element of life, but generally speaking, like there's certain standards that they're held to that say, like, the grocery store clerk is not held to, or the kind of.
So you're right. That's an.
I'm not saying it's quite equal, but it's
right. No, so that's a way to understand this. Perhaps that there are some professions. And getting back to Sylvia's point, we would ideally like the politicians to be that profession that would hold the Constitution as the Bible. By which they're living, and they're not influenced by money or lobbying groups, and they're not in it for personal glory or stature or anything like that. That there are, and there could be a few and there probably are a few politicians in America who are in it for the ideal and not for themselves. But yes, there are professions that we expect higher standards, right? I mean, doctors and nurses, lawyers, we expect to have a particular standard. And what'd you say, Gabe?
Well, lawyers?
Yeah, right. I know. With another sense of cynicism there too, right? We all know the lawyer jokes, but yes, theoretically, lawyers are supposed, and Gabe, as a lawyer himself, can be in on that joke as well. But yes, so we're going to see on the next page as well, in terms of clergy today, being held to a higher standard too. So it's just interesting that the hierarchy that society has, and that the Torah is teaching us about Israelite society, is very clear. The land of Israel is holier than other lands on earth. That the people who live in the land of Israel, that is the people of Israel, therefore have to be on a higher standard than other nations of earth, because the people of Israel are holy, living in the land of land of Israel, which is holy. Therefore, those are the higher standards by which other nations and lands try to live up to. And then within the people of Israel, you have the subgroup of the tribe of Levi, the Kohanim, who are even holier than the holy people of Israel. Okay, so that's the hierarchy that the Torah is presenting to us. And in this day and age, where we still have Kohanim and Leviim as part of the Jewish community, right? Just looking around on the screen right now, there are 2 Kohanim and 1 Levi who's here on the screen, two Leviim actually on the screen. So, right, but not to insult the Kohanim and Leviim on the screen. It's just that you don't have the jobs in the Jewish community anymore that you used to 2,000 years ago when the temple was standing. So yes, in Hebrew name, you are still a Kohen and a Levi, but in action, in practical reality today, there is no difference between you and the rest of the people of Israel today. So when we read the Torah in 2021 about how society was supposed to be set up 3,000 years ago, it doesn't exactly gel. So that what the Torah is teaching about Kohanim could really, in some regard, could apply to all of us, that we should all try to live up to a particular high spiritual holy standard as best as we can, based on the lifestyle that we're living. And no matter what job we have, we can try to do everything we do at work and also at home and in our waking hours, do everything we can in as moral, ethical, and holy way as possible. So it might seem anachronistic when we're reading these portions from the book of Leviticus, but if we can apply those homiletical standards to life today, then it might make some sense. Okay, so the commentary continues then on verse 1 about the Kohanim, the priest, the son of Aaron. So the commentary says, declare these rules to the Kohanim because they are descendants of Aaron. Remind them that their distinctiveness is based on their forebears, not on their own merit. And let them pass on to their children the importance of that lineage and the obligation to be worthy of it. So Hirsch, Samson Raphael Hirsch, a couple of weeks ago, I referred to him again from the commentary saying 150 years ago. It's really more like 200 years ago that he lived and wrote. So he's adding that don't think, Kohanim, that this is all about you as an individual Kohen. It's about you and your ancestors, and that you and the line from which you are descended. So you should feel humble that you have been fortunate to be born into this line, as opposed to you yourself being worthy of this on your own, right? So it's a sense that, according to Hirsch, to add a little bit of humility to the Kohen, where it might be very easy for the Kohen to think, look at me, I'm the most special among the entire Jewish people. Look at the work I do that nobody else gets to do. The work can quickly go to their head. This is a sense that Hirsch is saying, no, try to remain humble. Another comment is, tell the Kohanim to be sons of Aaron indeed, and not only in descent, pursuers of peace and reconciliation as Aaron was, right? So another idea here is that live up to the kind of person that the first Kohen was, who Aaron was, and that's what the Kohanim are supposed to do. And then this other paragraph, as public figures, the Kohanim must be role models of dealing with grief and loss, because we're about to read about how the Kohanim have to refrain from attending certain funerals. The Kohanim must be role models of dealing with grief and loss, balancing their personal sorrow with their commitment to serving the people and the obligation to accept death as part of God's plan for the world. A Kohen may willingly acquire ritual purity impurity by coming into contact with the dead body of a family member, for he owes his priestly status to his family of origin. He may not do so, however, for the corpse of a friend or for a relative by marriage. So here's where the general impurity laws come into conflict with a Kohen who has to be pure all the time. So we know from the Torah that coming into contact with the dead is the highest form of impurity, because you don't have to physically touch the dead person in order to become impure. You just have to be under the same tent, according to the Torah. You be in the same airspace, which in modern times means being in the same building as a dead person makes one ritually impure. And so so you have that as a basic element of purity and impurity, contact with the dead, which applies to all Israelites, not just Kohanim, applies to all Israelites. And then a Kohen who is serving in the Mishkan and later in the temple has to be ritually pure all the time. So has to be sure that they don't come into contact with the dead in any way. But a Kohen is a person. And if somebody in the Kohen's family dies, the Kohen is commanded to take part and be a mourner. But if it's an in-law who has passed, he's not allowed to be involved in those procedures. Just a second, Iris. And if it's a regular Israelite, the Kohen is not allowed to be involved in those regular procedures. Only funeral procedures, only for his immediate family for whom he would be saying Kaddish. Yes, Iris, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Why is a dead person considered impure?
Right. So we don't know. The Torah says so. And for some, that's not a satisfactory answer. I understand that. And certain times for Torah law, sometimes we have to accept it because God said so, right? Why are certain animals, fish and birds suitable to be eaten and others not? That's simple. That the only explanation for that is God said so. For the dead, there's lots of commentary about that, why contact with the dead is the highest form of impurity. All of it is commentary because the Torah doesn't explain it. And the Torah itself does not give a reason. So we can only imagine that there's a mystery. The mystery of life is fully put in our face when someone dies, right? In other words, the fact that we are alive right now and hopefully we're all relatively healthy, we don't think about being alive every day. We take it for granted. It's only when, God forbid, something happens to us that affects our functioning that we see the mystery of life and how much out of control our lives really are. So it's possible, one explanation of why contact with the dead is the highest form of impurity is that that's the life force has departed from that body. The Kohen, who is the embodiment of life force and God in the enactment of the rituals, would then, the person who embodies life force, the Kohen, coming into contact with a body that no longer has life force in it, would take the life force away from the Kohen. That could be probably the most logical explanation to the illogical religious laws. Okay, not all religious laws are logical. They are faith-based, and you have to take a leap of faith. One who is religious takes a leap of faith in order to maintain a complete religious lifestyle. Yes, Gabe, unmute yourself.
I remember hearing that Kohanim are also obliged to mourn if there's someone who dies who has no one else to mourn for them.
So that's not from the Torah. That could be something that the rabbis added in their discussion of laws related to the Kohen. It's an interesting concept to add to the sense that the Kohen has to be humble. And so, a Kohen might think, here am I offering officiating at the worship service. I can't be bothered with the details of Joe Schmo's life. But here, if the rabbis are saying, if Joe Schmo doesn't have any relatives, well, the Kohen, this high and mighty Kohen, has to mourn for them. So again, it could be the rabbis adding that to insist that the Kohen be as humble as possible. And certainly the rabbis saw in the last decades of the temple in Jerusalem how corrupt the Kohanim were, right? Partly because of the Kohanim and partly because of the Roman Empire, who imposed high priests onto the people of Israel, so that Israel wasn't even in charge on their own of assigning and determining who the high priest would be. So the whole system, the Kohen system in the temple in Jerusalem, became corrupted and subject to influence by the Romans and by wealth. So it could be that rabbis were just trying to teach a lesson in light of that corruption.
Yeah, I seem to remember that even the Kohen Gadol was obliged to.
Yes, it could be. It does sound familiar, and I just know that it's not mentioned here in this portion, but what you're talking about, but it is taught elsewhere in rabbinic literature. Sylvia, did you have it? Yes, go ahead. Unmute yourself again.
Many years ago, I would say close to 30 years ago, Fran Kenske's dad died.
Yes.
And we took turns. There were several of us who took turns through that night before the funeral, sitting with the body.
Yes.
So what I hear now, what we're reading now, makes me wonder why were we allowed to?
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question, Sylvia. So the laws related to preparation of the body for a funeral is called Chesed Shel Emet. The whole category it's the highest form of acts of compassion we can do, because we don't get a thank you for doing it, right? The dead can't say thank you. So preparing the body, so all the work of the Chevra Kadisha that does the washing and the dressing of the body, and then other people, whether it's the Chevra Kadisha or other people who work as shomrim, sitting with the body from then until the funeral service begins, all of that is coming into contact with the dead. So why can we do that? So yeah, it's a very good question, because we're not supposed to become impure, but we can't help the fact that we are going to become impure. Death is all around us, and certainly in the time of the rabbis and into the Middle Ages, really you couldn't literally go a few steps in public without being in contact with death. So it was all around us. So the ceremony for becoming purified from coming into contact with the dead only worked when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, right? Because it involved a sacrifice that had to be made. So the whole description in the portion Hukat, chapter 19 of the book of Numbers, describes this ceremony, which is a never-ending spiraling kind of ceremony. So the Kohen has to offer a red heifer, a uniquely colored cow, as a sacrifice to be burnt to ashes on the altar. Those ashes mixed with water and with hyssop combined together to sprinkle on the person who had come into contact with the dead. So that makes the person who come into contact with the dead pure, but the Kohen who does the sprinkling becomes impure. So then he has to undergo a purification process from having done this purification ceremony for an Israelite who has become impure from coming into contact with the dead. So the ritual itself highlights, the illogical nature of that ritual, highlights the sense from a religious perspective, how unusual, how scary, and how mysterious death is. And by providing a ritual for which we can deal with it, helps us center ourselves and realize that there's something to do when chaos reigns in our life, right? With the rituals the Jewish rituals surrounding death and mourning help center the mourner and give the mourner something to do and stay occupied while dealing with grief. And so, because if there were no rituals for the mourner to focus on, it makes the grief that much harder to deal with. Okay, so those of us who have been in mourning, God forbid, know how difficult it is. And know that if you had Shiva, if you went to Minyan, if you're saying Kaddish, knowing that there's another Minyan to go to, right? You wake up in the morning, there's Minyan to go to say Kaddish. And in the afternoon, there's Minyan to go to say Kaddish. In the evening, there's Minyan to go to say Kaddish. And during Shiva, you know that people are going to be visiting. Or even during COVID, you know you have a Zoom Shiva Minyan to be hosting or to go to. Then you know there are things, your day already has things in it that are planned for you to help you move along from 1 hour to the next. So ritual then helps us begin the coping and grieving and mourning process as we begin to learn how to move on with our lives. Okay, so that the rituals then that the Torah describes just highlight the chaotic nature of death and the unexplainable aspects of death. So that's the best way I can explain these things to us. So as far as the Chevra Kadisha goes and taking care of the dead, there's a beautiful midrash that why do we have to do this? Because God took care of Moses when Moses died, right? So God commanded Moses to climb Mount Nebo in order to take a look at the whole land of Israel, the land that Moses is not able to enter, and he dies there on the mountain, and nobody then knows from then on where exactly Moses has died. And so Midrash comes along, the rabbis develop these Midrashim so who took care of Moses and who prepared him for death and who buried him? Well, God did all of that. And so if God's going to do all that, how much more so we have to do it too. Yes, Iris, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Why there are a couple of reasons I've learned about, but why wasn't Moses allowed to cross over with his people?
Right. So I'll answer that question quickly and then get back to our portion, because though we are going off on tangents, which I like to do, I don't want to go far afield. So since I brought up, it was natural to ask a question about it. Why? Because the Torah said that he disobeyed God's commandment. He hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock in order for water to come out of it to provide for the people to drink. So that's in the book of Numbers there that God says people complain. Miriam dies. People complain about being thirsty. God says to Moses, speak to that rock over there and water will come out. Moses hits it instead. So because of going against God's commandment there, he was punished. So I'll just leave it at that. And when we get to that portion, we'll talk about it some more. But yes, just like your eyebrows are raised, Iris, with my answer to the question, that
Not fair.
the rabbi's eyebrows were raised as well, trying to figure out why that minor infraction could lead to Moses's this great punishment of not being able to lead the people into Israel.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to look at something else below the line on page 718. Right. Okay. Let's read verses 2 through 8, and then I want to look below the line with a commentary on verse 8. So verses 2 through 8. So the Kohen is not supposed to purify himself by coming into contact with a person among his people. Verse 2, Ki im lish'ero hakarov elav, except for the relatives that are closest to him. Le'imo ule'aviv, for his mother and father. Ve'livno uvitos, or his son or daughter. Ule'achiv, for his brother. Ve'la'achoto habetula hakrova elav, his unmarried sister. That's how I'll translate it. Betula usually means virgin, but in this context, when filling out a ketubah, it's the woman who has a category next to her name, not the man, in terms of never married, so bitula, a never married woman, a grusha, a divorcee, or which is a different Aramaic word on the ketubah, or an almanah, which is a widow. So those are the three categories of woman. And so again, bitula, I have no problem using the word bitula today. Some rabbis change that because they think it's too much associated with literally being a virgin. All right, and not getting into, I joke with colleagues about this. How many virgins really are under the chuppah? Okay, even if they've never been married before. So it's not about sexual behavior or sexual history. It's about never being married before. And a never married woman has the highest status. She's worth the most, 200 zuzim. The other categories are 100 zuzim. Oh, and the other category is a woman who converts to Judaism. So those are 4 categories of women. All other categories are 100 zuzim. The never married woman is 200. And it's important here only because if his sister, if the Kohen's sister is married, well, someone else is taking care of her. He doesn't have to be the one to take care of her. Her husband or her children would be taking care of her. So if for the Bible and for the rabbis, a woman is taken care of by other people. She's not on her own. So, verse 3, his sister who is not married, who is close to him, asher lo hayta la'ish, who's never been married, la yitama, for her, he can impurify himself. Lo yitama ba'al ba'amav lahechalo, but he shall not defile himself as a kinsman by marriage and so profane himself, which means to your in-laws, not to your brother-in-law, to your sister-in-law, to your mother-in-law, father-in-law. 5, lo yikrachu korcha berosham, they shall not shave smooth any part of their head. Ufa'at zikanam lo yigalechu, and they should not shave the corners of their beards. So that would be these two, the sideburns, and also down here on the chin. These are the payas, right? So when an ultra-Orthodox person has payas, it's from this word, the payah. Payah is singular, payot is plural, pronounced in the modern Israeli way. Pronounced in the Ashkenazi way, it would be payos or payas, and that's why it's these. So it's defined by the rabbis as these two corners of your beard, right? The upper corner, where your beard starts at the top of the sideburn, and then these two corners, either side of your chin. So because the Kohen isn't supposed to shave, the rabbis say all Jews aren't supposed to shave. Lo yisratu saratet, they should not make gashes in their flesh, right? As a pagan idol worshippers or pagan priests might gash themselves as part of the ritual service. The Kohanim should not think that they're doing the same thing that pagan priests are doing. They should not gash themselves in worship. Kedoshim yihiyu leElohehem, they should be holy to their God. V'lo yachalalu et shem Elohehem, and they shouldn't profane the name of their God. Ki et ishe Adonai, because for they offer the Lord's gifts, or literally the Lord's fire, lechem Elohehem, the bread of their God, he makrivim b'hayu kodesh, they are offering and they should be holy. So they have to refrain from these things because they're offering holy things to God. Isha zona v'chalala lo yikachu, so he can't engage in relations with a prostitute or a it just says here defiled by harlotry. It's two words, zona v'chalala. So it's just, for some reason, they're translating both those words as harlotry. The isha grusha isha, a kohen is not allowed to marry a divorcee. Lo yikachu, he should not marry. Ki kadoshu leElohav, because he is holy to his God. So engage. Marrying a prostitute defiles himself spiritually, and marrying a divorcee would defile himself spiritually. Now, the gray box below the line on 718 highlights for us that in Jewish and conservative movement Jewish law, because the temple is not standing in Jerusalem and the Kohen is not offering sacrifices anymore, and the status of a Kohen and a Levi is mostly symbolic today in the community, it's okay for a Kohen to marry a divorcee. So even in the time of the rabbis, if a Kohen had married a divorcee, even though it's not permitted, it's okay if he does, right? So after the fact, it's okay. He doesn't have to divorce the divorcee that he married. But in conservative movement Jewish law, it's okay from the beginning for a Kohen to marry a divorcee. If he has married the divorcee, the child, if they have a child, that child would not be considered a Kohen. So a Kohen passes down his status to his child. So, for example, Barbara on this screen is a Levi. Her father was a Levi. But she did not pass down Levi status to her daughter Jan, because she passed down Jewishness to Jan, right? Because Barbara's Jewish, Jan's Jewish, but it would only be if Barbara's husband was a Levi that Jan would be a Levi, right? So Jewishness goes down through the mother, tribal status, Kohen, Levi, Israelite, goes through the father, okay? So that's why Gabe's a Kohen, so his children are Kohanim. If his wife were a Kohen, well, that's extra special, but his children are not Kohanim because of his wife, they're Kohanim because of him. Okay, same with Howard on the screen too, who's a Kohen. Okay, so here what the conservative movement says, not only is a Kohen allowed to marry a divorcee, but their children would still be considered Kohanim too. Okay, because it's all symbolic in status. Okay, and then verse 8, right? Verse 8, v'kidashto ki et lechem Elohecha hu makriv. So he should be pure because the bread of God is what he is offering. Kadosh yihelach. They should be holy to you, ki kadosh ani Adonai mekadishchem, because I, God, am holy who makes you holy. So I just want to conclude our class today with this below the line comment. You must treat them as holy, right? Treat the Kohen as holy. Rabbis and cantors are no different from other Jews, right? So the commentary immediately connects to the idea that Kohen was the officiant, was the clergy of the community at the time that the temple was standing. Rabbis and cantors are the officiants of the Jewish community today. Rabbis and cantors are no different from other Jews, right? So in other words, a Kohen has to be on a higher level of holiness. A rabbi and a cantor, you would expect to be on a higher level of religious behavior, but we are no holier than anybody else. They have no special powers. Rabbis, in just a second, I just want to read these couple of sentences. The rabbis and cantors have no special powers, no obligations devolve on them that do not apply to all Jews, right? I'm just as obligated to pray 3 times a day as everybody else is. I have to keep kosher just like everybody else does. I am subject to all the rules of Judaism as everybody else does, and everybody can be a rabbi or a cantor. It's just a matter of going to school for a certain amount of time. But if you're willing to do that, anybody can be a rabbi or cantor. And then the commentary goes on, 10 shoemakers can make a minyan, but 9 rabbis can't, right? Just to highlight this idea, there's nothing extra special holy about us, right? In other words, let's say we have double holiness than everybody else. You can have 5 rabbis to make a minyan instead of 10 regular Jews. That doesn't work that way. We're regular Jews like everybody else. So if there are 9 rabbis in the room, you're still looking for. I mean, I remember at a rabbinical assembly convention years and years ago, I had the wonderful task of being in charge of minyan at convention. So I had to be sure that who was going to be davening, leading the service, and that there would be a minyan. And I remember one mincha where people, it wasn't the most popular service of the day. I was out in the hall trying to get people to come in to for minyan. So even at a rabbinical convention with all these rabbis there, it was still hard to make a minyan for mincha. So this comment here, nonetheless, rabbis and cantors are considered clay kodesh, instruments of holiness or holy vessels, because through their knowledge and teaching and by life, character, and commitments, they show the way to a life of holiness. So within the Jewish community, clergy are called clay kodesh, these holy vessels, but it's really a misnomer. We're not holier than anybody else. It's just that we're in this category of being facilitators for holiness. So Iris, what did you want to ask?
Just a simple question. If your name is Cohen, does that are you a Kohanim?
No, Saul Cohen has the last name Cohen. He's not a Cohen. A lot of that has happened, and there's also a Levi in the congregation, Michael Levi, who's not a Levi, who's not a Levi. So you would think with the name Cohen or Levi that you would be a Cohen. That just so happens Sylvia Levy's husband happens to be a Levi. Marv Levy is a Levi, but not all Cohens in America and not all Levies in America are Kohanim and Levim. It's just easier for the customs official in Ellis Island or Philadelphia or wherever they're getting off the boat, instead of writing Katzenellenbogen and not knowing how to spell that, they just say Katz or say Cohen, and just easier. Okay, that's a Jewish name. We'll give you the name Cohen and just leave it at that. And that's for a lot of them. That was the case.
That's how my husband got the name Hyman. I think it was really Hochman, but it was changed at Ellis Island.
Yeah, because they can't. Those people who are working there are not familiar with the Eastern European names and accents, and it's just easier. How do you go spelling it in English? So that's just easier to do. So I wanted to stop here for today. Just the sense of holiness, this category of the Kohen himself, and just this walking this fine line of taking on a job that has extra holy responsibilities, and then what what the Kohen would need to do to live up to it, and what we as Jewish people today have to do or should strive to do in living a life of holiness. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. Stay safe and healthy. Enjoy the weather today, and see you all next Wednesday.
Right. Yasha Koach.
Bye. Have a good week.
Same to
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.